All right, I'm now joined by Djene and Pascal Robert. Thank you so much for coming on, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yep, thank you for having us, Ben.
You got some really cool intro music, man. That's a whole kind of like 60s Dick Cavett vibe, man. The jazzy kind of tones. Nice. Did you make that yourself? It's very good.
I did not. It comes from Cole James Cash. I mean, obviously, he's not playing every instrument or anything, but he's the one who donated it, to us as intro music. Who, by the way, thinking about Cole this week because he, he'd spent like his entire life in California. I think except when he was in the military, and then then he just very recently moved to Canada because he married a Canadian woman, and like right after he got there, he slipped on the ice and shattered his leg. So he's like bedbound right now. So thinking about Cole, I mean, at least he was in Canada, so he doesn't have like a $10,000 medical bill, but still pretty brutal. But yeah, the intro music is all to his credit. So, speaking of Canada, one of the odd things about that country, which I grew up very close to, here in Michigan. Actually, I like to tell people accurately that I grew up about an hour north of the nearest Canadian border because you have to drive south from Lansing to Detroit, for the nearest border crossing. And in a lot of ways, it's a lot like it is here. But the nominal head of state is the Queen, and the British monarchy has been in the news a bit lately because of the Meghan and Harry Oprah interview. And the people at the National Review are very agitated about the thought that people might be having bad thoughts about the monarchy or want to end it. So this is the article, An American Defense of Britain's Constitutional Monarchy, by Joseph LeConte. I'm not quite sure how to say Joseph's last name. But this is in the National Review, and this is not unique to the National Review, by the way. I saw that I think the Heritage Foundation was doing an event about how the British monarchy was, I swear I'm not making this up, a cornerstone of Western democracy.
LeConte is at the Heritage Foundation, I believe.
Oh, okay. All right. So
yeah, he's at one of the centers there.
Okay, so LeConte might, as the author of the National Review article, might also have been the organizer of that event. So it might just be basically this one guy who's really worked up about defending the British monarchy.
I think it's absolutely hilarious and comical in so many ways that the National Review, the bastion of all things, classic Americana, 1776, and the great, shining city on the hill, William F. Buckley, are now celebrating the monarchy that the American founders rebelled against. That was also oppressive.
Yeah, well, that's that is like the strangest and funniest thing about this, because if you're going to claim to be all about American patriotism and American values and all this stuff, then there could be literally nothing more American than hating the British monarchy. That is the origin story of the United States as a country, which actually is something. So I guess started right at the beginning of the article. LeConte says, historians may puzzle for many years over why a rambling, emotional interview between members of the British royal family and an American media tycoon come billionaire became a rallying cry to destroy the British monarchy. Now, as somebody who would very much like to destroy the British monarchy, I don't think there should be monarchies. I wish he was right. I think he's considerably overstating the case about how many people are reacting to it by talking about abolishing the monarchy. Djene, more people in the UK, you might have a different perspective on this.
Yeah, I would say this, like, there is a growing, I would say, apathetic republicanism in Britain. People aren't super motivated by the abolition of the monarchy. It's not like a cause celeb. But I think, younger generations are less enthralled by the kind of mystique and magic that the British monarchy represents. And, for my generation who grew up in the 1990s, and I think for even people a little bit older, we grew up with the scandals, the sort of public shaming, the Princess Diana affair, all this stuff. So, like, the monarchy is very much a kind of tabloid issue for people of my generation. Of course, there are older people, more conservatively oriented people are very attracted to the institution, if not the individuals as part of the monarchy. But I think one thing that's happening more than this interview is the fact that the Queen is aging. The Queen has presided over the British political system since the 1950s, and she's getting old, and we're looking towards a change of guard. Now, the Queen's success, people, even relatively, centrist people who are not usually taken by monarchy, have a kind of affection towards the Queen, largely because she has stayed out of politics. She's been largely quiet. She hasn't been particularly active. But, there has been rumblings about succession, and what's going to happen when, if Prince Charles becomes a king. He's way more outspoken. And so the monarchy is heading towards crisis. And that crisis will come to a head when Queen Elizabeth dies. But I don't think this interview, I think this is a bit of hysteria. And I think there's a kind of underlying, maybe a little bit of bigotry, perhaps.
Well, that's what I was going to ask about, what you guys thought about, because I think that even if their description of other people's motivations is wrong, that it could be revealing that, because you ask, okay, why is it that people who normally are, aroused by the mention of 1776, would be this defensive about the British monarchy, as Pascal pointed out. And the idea that it doesn't seem terribly implausible to me that for reasons you can speculate about, like they might just be irritated by Meghan Markle, speaking ill of the royal family. And so I don't know how much racism is in the backdrop of this or not, but I mean it is hard not to wonder.
I think it's not. I mean, I don't underappreciate the role of racism, but what I think it's more than just about racism. It's about protecting the institutions of the British monarchy and the institutions of Anglo-American empire and liberal democracy and all of that comes along from a burgeoning challenge in the contemporary era, whether you want to attribute it to wokeness or not, where empire, the British Empire, particularly white supremacy, etc., so on and so forth, are being challenged in ways in which the traditional sacrosanct narrative of these nation states, empires, and countries that are used to kind of propagandize towards patriotism are being challenged. And this is not something you only see in Britain. You see this in France right now, where they have, like, they're talking about the Islamo-Gauche. They're talking about how there's this the invasion of post-colonial studies and critical race theory into France is destabilizing the belief in French universalism, and all of this exists in a larger context, right? Like we cannot forget that Europe and the liberal Western world is in a crisis of a kind of Manichaean battle between reactionary nationalism and the traditional kind of centrist neoliberal order, with the rise of the UKIP, Nigel Farage Brexit situation in England. You have Marine Le Pen in France. You have Front National. You have Golden Dawn. You have all of these kind of reactionary constellations that have been developing really since the early millennium in Europe. and more so, particularly after the 2008 crash, compounded with phenomena you have particularly in Great Britain. For example, the Windrush scandal, where you had Caribbean immigrants in Great Britain who had been there for 50 years or so on and so forth, were being deported. And these people were actually British citizens. And also the fact that former British colonies like Barbados are actually trying to say we're done with being part of the British Commonwealth and the British Crown. So I think that what we're realizing, okay, is that there's an existential kind of angst amongst these institutions of empire, as you know, to use the term, the subaltern, if you will, are challenging the moral certitude of their hegemonic control over the Western world.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you can definitely see some of those anxieties here. That like the French case that you pointed out is really funny to me because as you have Macron and French politicians who were raising the alarms about like the threat of critical theory to French civilization, they're blaming it on as being an American import, which is of course exactly the opposite of what American reactionaries say. They blame it as on they call it French import. Yeah, exactly.
The reason I say this incident is particularly triggering is I think there is a racial undercurrent to it, which is secondary to the broader point that Pascal was making about monarchy, was people are freaking out about this interview far more than they were freaking out about Prince Andrew going on television and basically saying that, basically completely botching his defense of his Jeffrey Epstein relationship. So the monarchy is under major assault at the moment. But this, I think there is a kind of, because Oprah is involved, because Meghan Markle is a woman of color, I think that particularly gets the heckles of these conservatives up. So, I agree with Pascal's point about this is more broadly a kind of existential fear amongst reactionary nationalists. But I think this particular incident is particularly triggering, to use that word for them, because of the players in the piece. Because otherwise, why weren't they writing this stuff when Prince Andrew was botching an interview about his association?
Yeah. So for people who might not remember that, he said that even though he went to the Epstein Island, that he didn't do any pedophilia while he was there, and part of his defense was that the report of his involvement had said something about him sweating, and he said that he had a disease that meant that he was incapable of sweating, and then he was actually sweating during the interview when he said this. But he said that he'd gotten over it. He no longer had this disease. So this was probably like one of the all-time worst interviews about something like that. In terms of its convincingness. Like this is really, to come up with something comparable, you'd have to go back to like Jerry Sandusky's extremely ill-advised media appearances. When that scandal was going on. But yeah, I think your point is well taken. That it seems like the fact that they're more worried about it now than they were even then is interesting. We can certainly speculate about why that might be. But let's go through this, because this article, this is all we're going to do for this. I just wanted to go through it like piece by piece, Chapo reading series style, because this article is amazing. So. He goes on, but so it has the radical left. And I just want to stop there to parenthetically say that he never explains who he means by the radical left. I guess the National Review, you can just throw that out there and, people won't ask who you're talking about. What's the radical left? Is this, DSA, who's the radical left here. But the radical left has seized upon Oprah Winfrey's televised spectacle with Prince Harry and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, in a crusade to invalidate one of the most consequential conservative institutions on the world stage. Accusations of racism within the royal family are not the point. The aim of modern liberalism can be symbolically discerned in William Walcott's painting, Pulling Down the Statue of George III at Bowling Green, July 9th, 1776, is to tear down everything the monarchy represents. Tradition, authority, virtue, duty, love of country, and biblical religion.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that that's what he believes the monarchy represents is, I mean, the monarchy represents colonialism, imperialism, racism, white supremacy, wealth extraction, capitalist exploit, war, militarism, murder, genocide. I mean, those are actually the things that make empire what they are. And one of the major attempts that this article tries to make is to paint, as most conservative reactionaries do, try to paint the exploits of Western empire building as a civilizational message. It's like, oh, yes, we enslaved them, but we gave them, railroads and light bulbs, and we must be thankful. And our legal system is wonderful, and if we compare it to the Russians and the Chinese, who are suffering everywhere, I mean, it's absolutely absurd. But
yeah, and I'd also point out, as far as the connection to colonialism and everything, that like even literally, the current queen, not that many decades ago, was the one pinning the medals on the paratroopers, after Bloody Sunday, the massacre in Ireland. So this is, this is pretty recent history.
And not just that, the notion that this is some kind of ancient tradition, and I guess we'll get onto this a little bit more, but monarchy has invented itself and reinvented itself numerous times over the decades, and the British royal family is no different. A lot of the pageantry and things we see as tradition related to the monarchy are what Eric Hobsbawm called the invented traditions. These were things conjured up in the late 19th century by Benjamin Disraeli to reinforce conservatism at a time when they were facing a challenge from, liberalism. And at the radical end of British liberalism at that time was, the notion that it was a little bit silly that Britain, as the leading industrial power of the time, still had this quaint, institution of monarchy, which seemed superfluous in a modern age. We forget about the sort of early and mid 19th century traditions in Britain, by which monarchy was nowhere near as sort of well settled in society as it came to be later. I mean, just look at what they've done. Monarchy has, in the last 150 years in Britain, been nationalized, right? You've had the kind of you've had the thin skin of monarchy sort of pulled across the British nation. They changed their name, for example. They're the House of Windsor, right? They aren't the House of Windsor. They're imports from Germany. So
yeah, Hanover, right?
Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. And so the notion that this is tradition, this is a fabricated tradition. Of course, this is common in all national myth making. But even when we look at the monarchy and the things we associate with the monarchy, they are inventions of the 19th century. Largely, the monarchy today is not what the monarchy was in 1500 or at the time of the Norman conquest. So it's a kind of ridiculous mythologizing about history, but one that is very important to British nationalism. And I think that's why in Britain especially, there's such sensitivity towards it, because it provides this anchor point for a particular narrative of British nationalism.
Yeah, and it's also like, this is very funny to me that he's referencing this painting because I would think that if you're going to do an American defense of Britain's constitutional monarchy, the last thing that you'd be bringing up is this particular scene, right? Because this represents everything Pascal's talking about that contradiction, between America's national mythos and found in myth, and any sort of defense of the monarchy. That like it's. Of course, the statue of George III would have been pulled down at Bowling Green in 1776. Continuing, says the left's campaign has a better chance of succeeding today thanks to the stupefying ignorance of the history of Britain's constitutional monarchy. So I guess he's going to correct that for us, which afflicts even the most highly educated. Now is a ripe time to refresh our memories of the monarchy and recall the debt which Americans owe to the political ideals and institutions that it helped create. All right, it's ready for this. This is going to be his historical refresher about the monarchy. Britain's monarchy stretches back over 1,000 years, even before the Norman conquest of 1066, which is also a really interesting move because it seems like if you're going to defend this institution, I wouldn't necessarily be too eager to claim the earlier parts of that history. Especially if you're going to defend this as this like an enlightened institution that jives well with democracy. But he goes on to say, although Britain has flirted with absolute monarchy, in which the powers of the king or queen are virtually unlimited, the English have always returned to constitutionalism. The signing of the Magna Carta was one of the greatest hinges of political history. The monarchy agreed that no political leader was above the rule of law. The monarchy asserted the principles of due process and trial by jury. So this is a weird way of arranging the history, like saying that just starting with the Magna Carta, just being really literal about this. Like saying that they agreed to the Magna Carta, therefore it goes to the credit of the monarchy as an institution, strikes me as a little bit like saying that in 1930, whatever, the General Motors agreed to recognize the UAW, so therefore, like labor unions, were GM's idea.
Yeah,
go ahead, Pascal.
No, it's absolutely kind of absurd, right? I mean, he's talking about all of these kind of ruling class elite institutions that were, basically created by lords, by aristocrats, right? I mean, there's no mention about what the actual political economy of the British Empire or Great Britain was when this was happening. This is a country that was living under feudalism. They had serfs. People were basically landless peasants. The concept that he's putting forth that, we were an enlightened, noble nation that had, landed gentry. I mean, this is a country in which they have people where they're called lords today. I mean, it's absolutely absurd the way he tries to rationalize this, as if, he talks about how people are unaware of the history of the British Empire. I think the problem he has is that the aspect of the history of the British Empire that people are focusing on is what he does not like, which is basically the way in which the British Empire has been the bastion of all imperial conquest throughout the globe. And, is just the embodiment as to what many people in the global South and the black and brown subaltern view as rather vile, and even their allies, and it's problematic because those people are talking now, and he doesn't like to hear what they have to say.
I completely agree on that count. The problem that he's having is not that people are stupefyingly ignorant; it's that people are more and more informed about what has happened in the past in Britain. We saw it in the BLM protests in Britain, where they dumped the statue of a slave trader into the harbor of Bristol. People have been challenging. In Oxford, there's a campaign to take down the statues of Cecil Rhodes, a brutal imperialist. So that's the context. He's angry, and what he is talking about here is, perhaps it sounds strange to you, but it is not at all strange to me, because this is the canned standard English conservative fantasy about the history of Britain. Why is Britain superior not only to the brown people, but to the continental Europeans? Because we have this mythology that Britain's constitution and the democracy that has developed in Britain was a product of a long historical process, a smooth historical process, one which the hello.
Continue.
Yeah, one which the complexities of the process, where you have revolutions and reactions, are written out of history, and it's a kind of ruling class mythology that Britain is a stable system and the parliamentary system is the superior system because it has this long history of stability dating back to the Magna Carta. So it's a kind of a retroactive narrative in which history is selectively mobilized to create myths about this gradual progressive development of English parliamentary democracy, and is as evidence of Britain is superior to the revolutionary experiments that took place in Europe, continental Europe. So this is a classic conservative argument, a kind of Whiggish interpretation of British history, where it's like just this unilinear program, pathway to greater democracy throughout the ages, and one in which the monarchy plays a role. But of course, in reality, the historical narrative is not that clear, is it?
Well, I mean, look, if nothing else, almost exactly halfway in between the Magna Carta and the present, there was a king who very strongly asserted absolute, unlimited, monarchy, and was beheaded for it, after a successful civil war to overthrow him. So I mean, like that, that's the kind of thing that, like, really, like if you're thinking about that at all, if that's anywhere in your head when you're reading this, like, makes it seem particularly absurd. I mean, like, that's a hell of a flirtation. And
not only that, I just want to add another thing.
Yeah.
The notion that constitutionalism only existed in Britain is again ridiculous. If you look at monarchy across the European continent, you have in the 17th and 18th century shifts towards absolutism, but it's nowhere near universal. Look at a place like Poland, which had a very weak elective monarchy. Even in places like the Ottoman Empire, elites were able to put legal constraints on rulers. So, this is also a complete fantasy that Britain is the only place in the whole world where limited monarchy and some kind of constitutionalism exists, because Britain had no written constitution. So, the constitutionalism we're talking about is like this culture and convention of a limited monarchy. And that is not a uniquely British experiment. There are some peculiarities in Britain, which are, unique to the British case. But in the broad sense, again, it's English exceptionalism. And of course, as Pascal said, this English exceptionalism feeds into a kind of broader Anglo-Saxon sort of pan-nationalist fantasy about the role of the Anglo-Saxons in bringing civilization and modern politics to the world.
Yeah, so he immediately goes on to say no other political system at the time anywhere in the world upheld these basic concepts of justice, foundational to the American constitutional order. They still have no place in many parts of the world today, and it seems like there are a couple things going on there. One is the foundational to the American order, which skips the whole part about how literally the American constitutional order could only be founded by having a war against the British monarchy, which was trying to deny, American colonists, many of those rights. And also, of course, says are still alien to many parts of the world today, which is a sort of cheat code for not acknowledging the fact that obviously, human rights, constitutional protections, these are not concepts that, have no native roots anywhere except for this one particular island. That would be a very strange thing to think. I mean, this is one of the best parts of Michael Brooks's book Against the Web, the part at the end, when he's talking about Amartya Sen and all of that, when he he makes the point that that defense of these basic rights, that can be grounded in things that can be found in any major cultural tradition. That again, it'd be very weird if there was a human tradition where that had lasted for a long time, where nobody had ever said anything, from which you could glean, these basic ideas. And I think he does a really good job there of balancing the sort of cosmopolitan universalism with acknowledging that this is not some special European invention. Never mind, right? A special English invention, which is really just an astonishing thing to think that there's nowhere else in all of the human societies that have ever existed that where anybody independently came up with the idea of any sort of constitutional constraints on what a king could do or what could be done to people in trials, except for this one island.
I mean, it absolutely absurd. I mean, as Djene is probably more aware of than I am, even though it may not seem as the model today to compare. But I mean, if you look at the history of Islamic civilizations throughout the world, parliamentary, rules of law, parliamentary establishment, even due process in terms of rights of evidence, which even exists in the Quran. The right to divorce for a woman predates anything that was going on in European civilization for years, and that's actually enshrined in the Quran. Property rights, inheritance rights, so on and so forth. So this notion that due process rights of assent, rights of protection is somehow inimical only to Great Britain or Western or European civilization is absolute bupkis. It's nonsensical. I'd like to hear Djene's thoughts on that, as someone who's aware of those traditions.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have the notion of an absolute monarchy is the anomaly when it comes to a monarchy anyway, and in the Islamic world, very rarely have monarchs been completely free of any kind of constraint. And in a system like the Ottoman Empire, which I know the best, in the 17th and 18th century, often seen as a period of decline, and Europeans talk about it as a period of decline because of the weakness of the Sultanate. There was a very interesting book written a few years back by a scholar named Baki Tezcan, who argued, actually, look, this is just ridiculous. In the 17th and 18th century, Ottoman elites were able to, find legal constraints to limit the power of the monarch, where groups like the Janissaries changed from being an elite army unit into being basically a popular militia in many towns, allowing artisans and working people to have some kind of say over government. So you have limited government, limited monarchy. You have very organized legal system. The Ottoman Empire had an exceptionally novel centralized legal system that took control of legal functions out of the hands of feudal overlords and put it in the hand of a centrally appointed official. So the notion that the rule of law or rights, and I don't know much about other civilizations, but I'm sure you can find analogies in China, in India, in all these places where you have developed civilizations that have developed legal systems and frameworks to deal with society. So I think, this is a lot of retrospective reading in history and ignorance of history in other parts of the world. History.
Yeah. So it says, when King Charles I tried to rule without parliament, he set off a constitutional crisis. There were other issues at play. The English Civil War, 1642 to 1651. Financial crisis, included in constitutionalism. In the end, Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan lost the argument. So this is a 3-sentence version of the English Civil War that completely omits the fact that the that the victory of Parliament, the defeat of royal absolutism, also meant the temporary abolition of the monarchy, and in fact the beheading of Charles. Like the way he puts it here, well, it's it was a struggle between absolutism and constitutionalism, made it sound like it was about whether to have a constitutional monarchy, which again is just straightforwardly not what happened. That there was that they got rid of the monarchy entirely for the duration of the rest of Cromwell's life, and in fact that set off all kinds of you mentioned Hobsbawm earlier, like there are great books by there's a whole group of British Marxist historians.
Christopher Hill has a book, Century of Revolution, which is about the English Civil War, looking at it in a sort of Marxist framework. And I think a lot of the newer literature on the English Civil War, and I'm not at all an expert, talks about it as the War of the Three Kingdoms, as a war which was provoked by the question of centralizing power over a politically fragmented island. You have Scotland, Ireland, and England, and then you have Wales, which is kind of ignored and all this. But the English Civil War wasn't simply an issue of absolutism versus Parliament. And even the Hobbes mention of Thomas Hobbes's Leviathans actually leaves the path open for an assembly of men to operate in place of a monarch as the Leviathan. He's very clear that saying it could be an assembly of men, or it could be an absolute monarch. The key is to have undivided power. And what we see in the English Civil War is, a major degree of centralization across the British Isles, and a very brutal religious war in Ireland, which still has reverberations today.
Yeah, I mean all this constitutionalism he's celebrating didn't actually result in giving the vote to Irish Catholics until remarkably close to the end of British rule in the lower 26 counties. And of course, that's a walk in the park compared to a lot of the rest of the way that Britain ruled its empire. So I think that, I mean, I'm glad you brought up Christopher Hill. I think he's the one who wrote that book, The World Turned Upside Down, which is also about the English Civil War.
Yeah, he was a Civil War historian.
Yeah, all of the radical movements, the diggers and the levelers and all of that stuff that were sort of unleashed by that, which was all suppressed, of course, but all basically radical movements from below that were willing to take the extra step and say, getting rid of the king should only be the first step. We've just, I remember a quote that's always stuck in my head from that, from one of those pamphlets, this is only, we've only removed, in getting rid of Charles, we've only removed the top branch on the tree of tyranny, since of course there's still this whole aristocracy underneath that. So after this, he says, the decades that follow, England became the epicenter of the most important debates occurring anywhere over mankind's inalienable rights. Freedom of speech, of the press, the right to assemble, the right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience, saying that it became an epicenter of debates over these things is a very convenient way of missing how brutally the British government was cracking down on dissenters of all sorts for a very, very long time. After the time period that he's talking about. I mean, there are. Even plenty of Americans, but then especially plenty of Australians, who are descended from people who were deported to one of those places as punishment, for political dissent.
Yeah, and I think also one thing that I think we're sort of seeing in this narrative is credit for progress and democracy is not granted to the people who struggled for it, but is given to the monarchy, which at various periods has had to concede to popular mobilization. I mean, during the Civil War, after the execution of the king, you had like a wave of repression against the more radical wings of the English Revolution. So, this is basically stolen valor to the monarchy, as if the monarchy is the driving force for like historical for democratic progress in Britain, when in fact, what progress is made because of social struggle from below, and not because the monarchy wants to concede it.
It's like saying Henry Ford recognized that auto workers should be unionized, meaning that like he agreed to, recognize the union at the end of a struggle.
Exactly.
And I love the next sentence. All of these rights, of course, would be exported to the American colonists and enshrined in their state constitutions, which, of course, there's no of course about Americans being extended those rights. I mean, that, as has already been mentioned, we did fight, there was a war about that, about the extent to which, people in the American colony, well, the extent to which a certain kind of white people in the American colonies, who are, of course, the only ones who were ever, going to be granted those rights, were going to be granted them at all. That's what the War of Independence was about. The British monarchy, despite its often contentious relationship with Parliament, again, where this whole business totally aligns the beheading of Charles I, which is pretty contentious, became a indispensable ally in the struggle for self-government. The Glorious Revolution, 1688 to 89, marked another milestone in constitutionalism. And he's about to go to the Glorious Revolution, which is, Parliament, calling alternative, kings to rule over England, to substitute for the one they were having a conflict with at the time. But this idea again that first of all, even in this example, right? So there are a couple of paragraphs where we won't read the whole thing, where he goes through the history, the history of the Glorious Revolution in 1688 to 89, but you barely get the impression. He just mentions in passing James II, who was the person who was overthrown in the Glorious Revolution. And so you could almost read this and miss the fact that this was a revolution that was being conducted against someone. Like he says the monarchy was an indispensable ally in the struggle for self-government. And then he starts talking about, William of Orange coming in to replace James II at the behest of Parliament. So why is the monarchy represented by William of Orange and not James II in this equation? Never mind the stuff way after the Glorious Revolution you could talk about, in which the monarchy was very conspicuously not an ally of any kind, indispensable or otherwise, to anybody's struggle for self-government. Like, for example, a word that is not going to appear anywhere in this article is Chartists. The people who, yeah. Yeah, sorry, Gene, were you starting to say something?
No. I mean, I completely agree. It's suddenly poor old James is not the representative of monarchy. And at the beginning he's talking about love of country. It's like, so the legitimate Stuart king is overthrown, and we bring a Dutch army into the country. What does that even mean? Yeah, this is the problem that you expect from British Toryism. It's bizarre to see it coming out of somebody writing in an American magazine, which really kind of brings into focus the fact that the conservative obsession with 1776 is nothing to do with the nature of the revolution. It is pure symbolism and militarism, and it's a superficial obsession with a date and a few names, and nothing to do with the content of what that revolution is. And we've discussed this. I've discussed this with Pascal before. Whether how revolutionary was the American Revolution.
I'd say point blank that it was a bourgeois revolution. There was nothing revolutionary or radical about it at all. It was. I mean, when you're telling me your revolution is about the fact that you don't want to pay taxes, I'm not going to be particularly impressed.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a bourgeois democratic, revolution. Although even relative to bourgeois democratic revolutions in the 18th century, like the most shallow one, right? Like certainly compared to like what happened in France or elsewhere.
And Americans like to go on about how violent and terrible the French Revolution was. And I always like to fire back as like, you had a revolution, but you still had millions of people working in forced labor camps in the south of in the southern states of America. So don't tell me that the French Revolution was more violent and resulted in more violence. The American Revolution and the failures of the American Revolution to move into a more radical phase, which would have seen the abolition of slavery, is also violence. And
let's not forget that after the American Revolution, there wasn't even complete suffrage for white men in America. I mean, this doesn't even start happening until Jacksonian democracy, that we have to have, full, enfranchisement of, white males. So this notion that somehow the American Revolution is some, massive democratizing effort compared to, I think the greatest revolution of that era is the Haitian Revolution. Maybe I'm biased,
for sure.
Whatever, but
no, I like Zizek's line about this, that the Haitian Revolution in a sense is what made the French Revolution is only really coming into fruition with the Haitian Revolution, because that's of course against the will of the French themselves, but I mean that's like finally cashing the check that's written by the Declaration of the Rights of Man at the beginning of the French Revolution.
Yeah, so
and actually, I think the Haitian Revolution is an interesting. Actually, I think both the French and the Haitian Revolution are interesting reference points for what you're talking about, Pascal. Because if you think because I think in a lot of ways the American Revolution is like maybe what France would have been like if it's like the very earliest stages of the French Revolution. Had sort of stopped there, right? Like before any of the Jacobin stuff. At which point, again, I think they were talking about only having suffrage, for a restricted class, of the population. Well, definitely, right? In 1789, only talk about suffrage for a restricted class of the population. And it wasn't until the new constitution that the Jacobins wrote, but then never actually enforced, because they said if there were a permanent state of emergency, that suffrage was supposed to be, you were supposed to get universal male suffrage. That didn't actually happen. Or even in the Haitian case, I don't know, remembering CLR James, before the actual slave revolution, that there was agitation by the,
street people of color. Jean de Couleur.
Yeah. And before even that, right, that there were the big whites, in the colony were agitating for a greater level of independence, from of autonomy, from France, and then there was there were efforts by the what do you call it, the colored caste, in Haiti. And then finally, the actual slave revolt, which is so, and in some ways, it's like the American Revolution is just like the very earliest part of that. The big whites, in James's terminology, doing the having, rebelling against the British overlords. But then, as Djene says, America never the actual fulfillment of America's bourgeois democratic revolution was several decades later. That was 1861 to 1865. Is actually extending.
I would argue that it didn't happen until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act. I mean, I would say it took several decades and over a century afterwards to be fully. Some would argue it's never been fully realized, quite frankly.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an important sense in which it's never been fully realized. But I mean, even the sort of like most, well, actually, yeah, I mean, the most sort of basic institutions of like at least capitalist like free labor, didn't come about until the late 19th century, and something as basic as voting rights, didn't come about until the mid 20th century. So it's not. And of course, the middle phase of that was incredibly violent, right? I mean, probably. I mean, my guess would be many more people died in the American Civil War than in the French Revolution. Maybe not if you count the wars of the French Revolution. I'm not sure, but that's incredibly bloody, which makes that sort of Hannah Arendt comparison, like, oh look, we had like the nice peaceful one here in the U.S. And it was all violent and terrible in France. That only works if you ignore big parts of the story.
Yeah, and that's the same kind of narrative that the British weave about their historical past, right? You hear it. You were talking about it when you were talking about Mike Taibbi, when he goes, "Well, it's worked pretty well for 200 years." Well, has it worked really well for 200 years? That's a very dismissive way to look at a kind of history. And so this narrative of British history, this narrative of American history, of you have the revolution and then you have this like unilinear kind of march towards progress, this Whiggish development of democracy in America. It's basically the same as the kind of narrative that the British conservatives have been telling us about the development of British monarchy, trying to obfuscate the real and concrete struggles. But to return to the point I wanted to make is like, even the tepid content of the American Revolution is not really what these conservatives celebrate about the American Revolution. It's pure symbolism. It's pure American flag, rah, 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 1776. What happened in 1776? There's no content to it. Ask most conservatives, like, name the amendments. They'll tell you maybe the Second Amendment, the one with the gun, but not my favorite amendment, which is the one where troops can't be billeted into your house. I think it's the Third Amendment. The Third Amendment. But they don't know those amendments. It's just Constitution doesn't mean Constitution as a set of rights. It just means it's just a symbol of all things that are good in political culture. It's devoid of its content, and it just becomes like a symbol to put on your jersey to show, "Yay, America." There's no.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, which again is very, very clear in this article. So skipping ahead a little bit, says, thus a century before Americans launched a revolution to reclaim their chartered rights as Englishmen, England's monarchs had decisively rejected political absolutism, or a different way to put that would be Parliament repeatedly overthrew monarchs who asserted absolutism. So the ones who remained or were brought back or brought in to replace them, reluctantly accepted reality. They presided over a culture of common law rooted in mankind's natural and inalienable rights. In this way, they helped the West to imagine the core purpose of government, reimagine the core purpose of government to secure these God-given rights and freedoms for all citizens of the Commonwealth. The impact of all this on the American founders was profound. Not only the concepts embedded in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, but also in the very structure of the Constitution itself. And then there's this incredibly tortured attempt to make it seem like the American founders didn't despise the British monarchy.
Does he neglect the fact that the United States went to war twice within 50 years with Great Britain? You have the war. I mean, that's kind of like neglected by this all about all of it.
No, absolutely. Yeah. 1812 isn't mentioned at all. And there are some cursory references to the, Declaration of Independence, but not really the, the war that was then fought to establish that independence. And he says, as the founders designed the separation of powers, for example, they turned to Montesquieu, the French theorist who prided the English example. He was an ardent admirer of the English Constitution, wrote Russell Kirk in The Roots of American Order. He finds the best government is of age in the constitutional monarchy of England, where the subject enjoyed personal and civic freedom. So this is such a weird paragraph. Just like the argument is so garbled here that the founders praised a French thinker who in turn
deferred to the British.
Yeah, had expressed admiration for Britain. So this is what he's doing to make it seem like Washington, Jefferson, and everybody were great admirers of Britain's constitutional monarchy, which they had just fought a war to stop being ruled over. That they admired, that they were like influenced by a French theorist who had said nice things about the British constitutional monarchy. But of course, what he's aligning here is the fact that like Thomas Paine, really important figure in the American Revolution, and his pamphlet Common Sense was incredibly influential, and a lot of that was devoted to explaining why the very idea of a hereditary monarchy was offensive. Like when Jefferson and Hamilton were going at it later, one of the Jeffersonians' like big accusations against Hamilton was that they were crypto monarchists, and they wanted to have a monarchy again. Like this is like the worst thing that you could say about somebody in this era of American history, that they were like a secret admirer of the British monarchy. And then it gets really bad. And this next passage, we're not going to read the whole thing for what's left, but this next passage is the one that I most particularly want you guys to weigh in on. It is true, of course, that Great Britain built a massive colonial empire and was deeply engaged in the African slave trade. Gosh, that sounds bad. The monarchy approved through a royal charter the forcible enslavement of millions of human beings. With the support of the Parliament to the Royal Navy, Great Britain earned the lamentable status as the lead slave trading nation in the world. The left views this history as an indelible stain on the monarchy. It is a racist institution to its core, they claim. So he's acknowledging that colonialism and slavery, happened, and were clearly, clearly happened under the charter and blessing of the British monarchy. It says, well, the left thinks that this is, that this really stains the institution. Yet, the monarchy, the political guardian of the Church of England, was eventually confronted by the Christian conscience of Parliament, quickened by evangelical reformers such as William Wilberforce and Hannah More.
Stop. After 50,000 British soldiers died in the Haitian Revolution trying to bring back slavery to the Caribbean.
Yeah. And also, look at this. It's like, yet the monarchy as the political guardian of the Church of England. What the heck does that have to do with the rise of abolitionism in Britain? It's
the rise of abolitionism in Britain is a direct consequence to the rise of slave rebellions in the Caribbean, primarily in Haiti, but not only in Haiti, in Jamaica particularly.
And and one thing I will note: William Wilberforce was I went to William Wilberforce's school, and he was like, so he was a big hero of ours when we were at high school. So, they have Harry Potter style houses in English schools. Yeah. There was a Wilberforce house that, everybody wanted to be in. But, the notion that, it was just the conscience of the British, like Pascal says, that they had a sudden turn of consciousness is ridiculous. There had been abolition a long time in Britain, but what propels abolitionist movement in Britain to, a position where it can affect parliamentary change is changing economic and political circumstances brought about by the direct action of slaves in the Caribbean, as Pascal says, in making slavery an expensive and dangerous project. Not because suddenly the British elite didn't think slavery was profitable. And the way that he talks about the African slave trade is as if it's some kind of sui generis dark episode in British history, and not foundational to the creation of Britain's ability to become a world power. You go to places like Bristol and Liverpool, the streets, the buildings are named after slave owners. The wealth extracted from slave owners, slaves, cotton, and molasses, is what funded the British war machine, what put Britain in a position to take on the French Revolution, and in the 19th century emerge as the dominant military power, dominant imperial power. So it's as if that you can separate slavery and the Atlantic slave trade from the formation of Britain, or indeed any European colonial empire. Those colonial empires in the 19th century were direct outgrowths of that initial phase of capital accumulation and
primary accumulation.
Yeah, and it's also this phrase, yet the monarchy as the political guardian of the Church of England was eventually confronted by the Christian conscience of Parliament, even aside from the absurdity of acting as if after their prolonged involvement in building their empire and their industrialization on the foundation of slavery, that it just sort of belatedly occurred to British Christians, that it was wrong to treat people this way, and that they'd made some terrible mistake, as if there were no. This just came out of nowhere. That this is just something that emerged from Christianity, per se. And not, yes, I mean, the slave revolts in the Caribbean, by the way, the fact that Britain had been like cut off from its slaveholding American colonies, and thus lost a lot of its, what it was gaining, from the slave trade, but not that they didn't still, weren't still supportive of the Confederacy in the Civil War, but this phrasing, yet the monarchy as the political guardian of the Church of England was actually confronted by the Christian conscience of Parliament, like, it's just such a weird sleight of hand to somehow say, well, anti-slavery sentiment was associated with Christianity and the monarchy was associated with Christianity, so it's kind of sort of like the monarchy did that.
Mm-hmm. It ignores the fact that many of the people involved in the abolition movement in England were nonconformists, so they weren't even particularly tied to the.
Yeah, they weren't even part of the Church of England. And what about Britain's history as a colonial power? Yes, indeed. What about that? No one disputes. This is always a nice thing to say if you're writing an essay and you want to like sweep something into a corner. No one disputes that there were many dark episodes in the monarchy's quest to expand and defend its empire. Immediately onto the whataboutism, many nations have a history of colonial adventurism. France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Germany, Russia, Turkey, China, Japan, the United States, all have been engaged to varying degrees in empire building. Under Queen Victoria, at the peak of its power in the 19th century, the British Empire had no imperial rival. The legacy of its rule, though, is nothing like the Dark Kingdom of Mordor feverishly imagined by the left. Which, I'd like to, I think it might be interesting to get the perspective of people in countries colonized by Britain about whether they think that it's that experience was nothing like that. No empire other than Great Britain brought to its colonies the technological tools, railroads, modern medicine, etc., and the political ideals, capitalism, the rule of law, etc., that made possible the development of stable, egalitarian societies. So,
like where, Nigeria?
Yeah, apparently that's the.
I think he's thinking of Rhodesia.
Yeah, all of these egalitarian societies that were left behind by the British Empire. I mean, there's just nothing but egalitarianism, left in its wake.
I mean, it's absolutely absurd. I mean, I mean, the condition of the colonial Africa that's controlled by the British. These countries have been stripped of resources. They've been stripped of the whole border territory in terms of what these countries were manufactured to facilitate colonialism and wealth extraction. None of that infrastructure and developing stable governance existed at all. Tribal warfare was fostered. The British succeeded at divide and conquer. Was one of their main tactics in terms of how to control their colonial powers. So this notion that the British governance in its colonies maintained some kind of wonderful, stable kind of infrastructure. We built the trains. Is all you have to look at is the condition of the countries that were left behind. I mean, if we're arguing that they did a better job than the French, okay, maybe, but in terms of laying infrastructure, but the countries that make up the colonized from Great Britain are basically poor third world countries.
Yeah, I mean, look at Iraq. British created Iraq as a country. It's a disaster. The French created Syria. It's a disaster. So this is like very insidious writing, right? Firstly, it dismisses bad parts of British colonial history as episodes. As if it's like Star Trek. There are some bad episodes, but overall, it's a good series, right? But the fundamental problem with the British Empire is that it is to its core is rotten, and its impact on the people who are colonized, varied to a certain degree. But I mean, like even the infrastructure is stupid. Firstly, all the colonial powers brought infrastructure to the places that they colonized. And at the end of the day, Ben, if I break into your house and build a tarmac driveway so that I can rob your house more efficiently, and then when I've stolen everything from your house, I say, look, though, buddy, I built you a freaking new driveway. So be grateful. It's utterly offensive. And of course, he goes on to quote Niall Ferguson, the ultimate imperial apologist, who basically sticks his oar in American politics because he wants America to become an empire on the an empire in the way Great Britain was. So look at India, deindustrialized and turned into basically a drugs farm. Look at countries that have been under colonial rule and countries that have not been under colonial rule, right? We should compare like with like, right? So people always want to compare America to the Soviet Union, but obviously Russia was an extremely backwards country when the revolution happened, and America was an advanced industrial country. Let's look at India and China. Today, India is in a far weaker position than China was, and part of that is the horrific legacy of British colonialism and 2.5 centuries of plunder. And the notion that these societies couldn't have modernized without colonialists coming in is nonsense. You've had countries from Japan to the Ottoman Empire that were maintained independence from colonial rule, some more successfully than others. They brought railways, they brought telegraphs, they set up schools, they adapted things. There's no reason to think that these things could not have spread without European civilizing mission. And this is what it comes down to. It's not biological racism directly, but this is basically the 21st century version, which is that British Anglosphere culture is superior, and these natives, they messed up. The reason that countries are messed up is on them, right? We handed them over like a good state of, all they needed to do it. And if they failed, well, it's been 50 years. It's been 60 years since they've had independence. It's their own fault. And it's a way to whitewash themselves from the legacy of colonialism. And of course, they portray it as if it's a moral argument, like that everybody in Britain has to self-flagellate every day about, oh, the British Empire was bad. No, it's just recognized. Let me just give you one example. When Brexit happened, I have a bunch of Tory-leaning friends. They were like, well, Brexit's happened. We'll just go back to trading with the Commonwealth. And I was like, bro, those countries in the Commonwealth, they do not look back on the good old days of the Commonwealth in the same way that you guys do. Even the places like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand don't look back. So you think India, Pakistan, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, you think they're going to look back and be like, oh, Britain's out the EU, let's get back to joining this like great trading bloc, just like the old days. Utter delusional notion of, that had real world political consequences, right? This utter delusion about Britain and the way the rest of the world views it. Does that say everything about Britain is bad and Britain is evil? No. If another power had been in the same position, the Japanese weren't exactly wonderful colonialists. But the point is, empires, and particularly 19th and 20th century colonial empires, whether they're of the European variety, the American variety, or the Japanese variety, were brutal, fundamentally brutal, extractive institutions.
Yeah, and again, like I think one thing that just should not be lost in this, that's just obfuscated throughout this article, is that all of this constitutionalism, all of the democratic rights that people enjoy in Britain today, had to be fought for. Like none of it, like even going back to the Magna Carta with just like slightly lower level aristocrats fighting the king, for certain political rights, up through the 19th century. You mentioned the Chartists, people fighting for the People's Charter, which was the demand for universal male suffrage. Lots of people in Britain in the 19th century were killed, fighting for the right to vote. And it was those were brutal, bloody struggles. And of course, the female suffrage didn't happen until the 20th century. And again, it was a very hard fought thing. So giving like the top level of the British system, the monarchy, any sort of credit for eventually giving up at the end of these struggles is just a bizarre way to argue. And you're right, of course, Djene, it's not like that there's anything, terribly unique, about the British Empire, although I will argue that a lot of the divide and conquer tactics they used, pitting different ethno-religious groups against each other, have a maybe uniquely bad effect on the world today, if you look at a lot of conflict zones throughout the world. But it's not that it's uniquely bad, it's just that having empires is bad, and for very much the same reason, having monarchies is bad. It may be largely symbolic. I hear what you're saying about the apathetic republicanism. People don't like the institution, but aren't that worked up about it. But I mean, if nothing else, even to the extent that you grant that it's purely symbolic at this point, and takes up a lot of money, and there's a certain question about whether any amount of it's an element within a constitutional system, but as relatively powerless as it is now. But okay, except that it's purely symbolic. It's a symbol of terrible things. I mean, it's if nothing else, it's a symbol of extreme inequality. That that there's this one particular family that should get to at least have these ceremonial head of state functions, because of their blood. I can't imagine a more vivid symbol of equality. So if nothing else, yes, even if it's a symbol, it's a terrible symbol. It's like, that's like saying that like a statue of Robert E. Lee in the town square is just a symbol. Yeah, it is, but it's a bad symbol. You shouldn't have that symbol.
Yeah, I mean, for the conservatives, it's a symbol of hierarchy, and that's why they defend it.
Pascal, any final thoughts?
My major question is that what exactly are they worried about happening if we just have an honest conversation about the legacy of these empires, these nation states that participated in these atrocities? I mean, this is the nature of empire throughout the world. I mean, the Mongol Empire was brutal, and as Djene talked about, the Japanese, in terms of how they dealt with other Asian countries, and China was horrible. We can go back to Babylonia. Why exactly do you think, and I'm asking your opinion, is it so utterly threatening to these reactionaries to have people just expose the truth about these? Are they afraid that people will demand culpability? Do they think that it will threaten their nation state project? Do they think it will mean the end of patriotism, which of course is a charade used to just justify all kinds of exploits anyway? What is behind it? I'm interested in your thoughts.
I mean, my thought is, I think there's a lot of things you mentioned are part of the story. I think some of it is to do with hierarchy, but I think also some of it's to do with national projects, right? There's a good Ottoman word, yek vücut, which means like one-bodied, like an organism. And, national identity is as much about forgetting as it is about remembering, right? And building narratives about who we are, and so that we can all operate within a sort of confined political system, like of what it is to be an American or a Brit. And I think these narratives undermine those national official nationalisms, or those political narratives that certain groups want to impose on the nation. What is modern politics in many ways? Modern state formation is not only the unification of institutions and centralization of institutions, but it's also the creation of a uniform political identity where citizens have an appropriate set of values. They remember the same things, and they have the same narrative, which allows them to operate. If suddenly that breaks down,
to the benefit of elites.
To the benefit of elites. And of course, there are different narratives that always compete with each other, right? There's this conservative narrative, but there's a liberal version of this narrative, which is a little bit more critical, but still sees America as fundamentally a powerful good. It's just like it didn't live up to its ideals. So, you have the conservative version in America, which is like, we didn't do anything wrong. Why are you complaining? Everybody else did it. And then you have the kind of liberal version, which is like, the principles were good, but it took us some time to live up to them. But at the end of the day, it's trying to build this like unified narrative. And I think as more people learn about history, as more voices from groups that, were previously excluded from the public conversation come to the fore, I think that's profoundly destabilizing. Because suddenly people are saying, you know what? I don't think Thomas Jefferson was awesome. I don't even think Abraham Lincoln was awesome, right? And suddenly you're like attacking all these like symbols that have a deep emotional value to these people. Like, it's an emotional response in many cases. Conservatives like to present themselves as being like the kings of rationality and cool calculation, but they are fundamentally reactive and deeply, deeply, I don't want to use the term emotional, but hysterical about any challenge to the symbols that they hold dear.
Yeah, I think there's also, there is a connection to present day politics because, if the what's the old line about how a conservative is somebody who stands athwart history, saying stop, that which is something that conservatives like to quote, but if you but the more you acknowledge the ugliness of the previous chapters, the harder it is to justify. And I don't want to, I don't want to shit on Taibbi too much here, but like that line that Djene quoted earlier about things having worked pretty well for 2 centuries. The more you acknowledge, not that I think is a conservative, but the more you acknowledge how badly things worked in those previous 2 centuries, the less you can justify things by saying, well, they worked pretty well, for the last 200 years. The more like the worse you admit the previous chapters were, the harder it is to defend things simply on the grounds that this is the way that they've always been.
Yeah,
in other words, it means that you have to succumb to the possibility you have to change and challenge the status quo.
Exactly. Yeah. That because if things were really that bad all of those times in the past, then you can't, because the essential move of conservatism, again, to go back to Michael's book Against the Web, is naturalizing or mythologizing historically contingent institutions, either saying, so the mythologizing like the crudest versions are like, oh, we have kings because the gods came down and told us that these are our kings. And more sophisticated versions are like, well, kind of like what you see in this article. And then naturalize it is just say, well, this, sure, maybe you might not always like it, but this is just the way that things are. There's no contingency. It's just, it's like complaining about the weather. What are you going to do? This is just like etched into the nature of things. And the more you undermine both of those, justifications, the more you see it as simply a matter of human choice, that to have these institutions or to discard them, and the more you see it as a matter of choice, and the more you see it as contingent, we just sort of happen to have these, but there's no grand purpose for which we have to. There's no there's no transcendent justification. It's not just part of the laws of nature. Then the harder it is to stop yourself from having to engage with the question of whether we should still have these things now. And again, the monarchy might be a relatively minor symbolic part of it, but it is a pretty potent symbol for the whole thing.
Yeah.
All right. Really appreciate both of you guys coming on. This was very good. I mean, I know that this silly article is almost like taking apart everything that's wrong with it. Is almost a waste of you guys. But I think that this was really good, and I'm optimistic that viewers and listeners will learn from it. So thank you guys for coming on.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Thanks for having us.